Oh my God, so this one time I told my friends I was running a battle royale game at Meltdown, and it was super fun. There were 2 teams of 5 going after the same prize. Matt and Marisha were there, Jason Charles Miller and Dodger were there. I had everyone dressed up in suits and cocktail dresses, served hors d'oeuvres, and all in the comic shop. As I was coming up with the story and arena, I realized that although I'm used to tables of 10 players, I needed an assistant game master. Oh yeah, I'm Satine Phoenix. This is GM Tips, and today's theme is GM Co-op. Back to Battle Royale, aka PvP RPG. I realized I needed an assistant. This way we could both introduce the 2 teams to the situation at the same time, and then lead them to the arena where I would take over the main GMing. Patrick, my assistant, would help keep track of the initiative and status effects. I often have a hard time with encounters that have too many participants. Having an assistant helps the smoothness of my storytelling, so I don't have to pause to find a thing. Later in the game, someone came in and I had them perform the monsters. It was this amazing battle that made me feel like I was conducting an orchestra. It was amazing. Having an assistant GM is fantastic, but what about having 2 game masters? Today I'd like to introduce Bruce and Keith Monach, the 2 game masters of Storm, a game we played in for almost 3 years.
Yeah. It was a long time.
It was a long time, and you guys tricked me because it started off as Dungeons and Dragons, but it evolved. Actually, no, it was really cool that it evolved.
Yeah.
There were the 2 of you game masters, and how many players were we at?
I think our most was above 20. Above 20
It
players.
was like 24.
There were
at
a
one
couple
point.
sessions we were above 20, and then by the end we had 10 to 12 pretty regularly.
And that's why you're here today, so we
Yes.
could talk about 2 game masters at the table. So,
And how to work together.
and how to work together. So earlier I talked about assistant GMs, but you guys actually co-GM'd.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
In the beginning, when we first came up with it, we thought it would be cool if we created a world by, I came up with one of the continents called Embler Tanith, and then Keith came up with...
So I came up with the second continent, Idriel, to the east, and then there was a third larger continent that the idea behind it was we would get the players to help define that setting.
The way we did our co-GMing was that when things happened that were Embler Tanith, I would do those things. And I made a lot of the final calls on character choices and the location and the history of it, whereas Keith did Idriel.
Yeah, so when they came, depending on where the campaign was going on, when the party came to Idriel, I then kind of stepped up from being second chair from when we were in Embler Tanith to first chair. I designed a lot of the major NPCs there. And then when it came to the last section, Deloran, the third continent, we split it up based on which regions we were more passionate about, which characters we created, that sort of thing.
I think one of the things that is the biggest advantages of being having more than one game master is that you're gonna have people in multiple locations. So it could be as complex as one group wants to go to one continent and the other group wants to go to another continent, to as simple as 3 members of the party sneak ahead to assess the enemy and see what's happening, while the rest of the party preps and organizes and sets up some sort of ambush or attack. And by doing it that way, you can do everything at the same time, which makes everything run smoother and is more fun for the players.
You had these things happening at the same time. You guys are separated. How do you share that information? Because as the game's going on, the party splits, the party comes back together. How do you guys didn't make it look complicated. It was seamless, so that when everyone got back together, it was almost like you guys were sharing brains. So how did you do that so seamlessly?
Well, obviously, preparation is one of the big things that keeps getting repeated on this show. But another thing that's important is knowing who is the lead and who makes decisions on different things. So, for example, when I would take a group away and do things, Keith knew that when we came back and they said, like, they ran into a monster, or they ran into this NPC, or they ran into this organization, and Keith thought to himself, I have no idea what happened. I don't know what the monster was. I don't know what the organization is. I don't know what it is. But he would say, okay. And then he would put that into his own game. And by doing that, by just saying yes, which is a common improvisational technique, we could make a seamless idea that we were working together and had planned a lot of things in advance, and we knew it was going to happen, and we knew it was going to happen in the other room the whole time, when in fact we just rolled with it.
Oh, that's awesome.
And one thing, when the party splits and they come back together, the natural tendency is you tell the other half of the party what happened. So during that period of time, if there's something that the other party did that I don't know about, they're telling me in addition to telling each other, and it gives Bruce and I the opportunity to step to the side and also tell each other stuff that happened that maybe the PCs aren't aware of. So there are these natural breaks in the game where you can take advantage of time to keep each other up to date.
So splitting the party, that's one benefit to co-GMing. What is another bonus to doing that?
The ability to bounce ideas off of each other can be huge, especially when, as you said, we started off as Dungeons and Dragons, and then once we hit a certain number of people, the main reason that we transitioned into this more homemade system was we needed something that could handle a larger group, that could play a bit faster. And when you're designing your own system or you're making house rules or changing the system in any way, it's really helpful to have somebody to bounce ideas off of and collaborate with to come up with the best possible solution.
And I do want to talk a little bit about the difference between co-GMing with someone and being an assistant.
Yes.
Because they are very different. When we did the Storm, Keith and I, we made it together. We split the world and we split the duties. And when he left and he was the GM, he was making the story. I've also had experiences where I was in charge and I had an assistant. In fact, I ran a series of games in college that I really enjoyed where I had 3 assistants.
Nice.
They were actually LARPs, much like Vampire the Masquerade, except that what we did was horror movies. And I would come up with a story throughout the night of something like you're in a haunted ghost town and the ghosts appear because it's the cursed night and you have to survive. And in advance, I would lay out an outline of like, this is what's going to happen. And when I ran that game, I actually had times where I was like, at 9 p.m., this is going to happen. At 10 p.m., this is going to happen, and so forth. And by doing it, my 3 assistants, who they might be in a completely different room, because when we ran these LARPs, we would be in like 6 different rooms in a building.
Wow.
And you wouldn't know or see or hear what other people are doing. So those assistants had to run the game and had to know what was going to happen and had to make their own story. But because we had this time chart, they could look at the clock and know, oh, it's 10 o'clock. That means that this terrible scream comes from the church or something. So even though I, as the main GM, was in one room, everywhere around this building, a storyteller was there to say, you hear a scream coming from the church. And it made it feel like a full unit story rather than people in chaos.
Let's talk about your pre-game house rules.
I would say that the biggest thing about when I game master, it's that my games have consequences. If you run at if there's a unit of soldiers and you're one person, you run at them with a sword, you're gonna die, or you might get seriously injured. So I always warn players in advance that their actions could lead to harm and death and losing limbs and all sorts of bad things.
It's true.
Yeah.
That's a thing that happens in your
Yes.
games.
and I also say that players are the protagonists of the story. At the end of the day, I'm running the game to let my players be heroes, be protagonists. So if they make good choices, and even more, if they surprise me, things often go well for them. And in keeping with this actions have consequences, there's danger around every corner, you are not the most powerful person in existence at any time. You are still a guy with a sword or a wizard with a handful of spells, but around the corner there could be some archmage who's been studying magic for 3,000 years, and he's gonna ruin your day.
Cool.
One of the other house rules that I think is important is how players communicate with each other, and differentiating between downtime versus action scenes. So not necessarily fights, but if something is happening and a player has to make a decision, in order to let the player make the decision, it's important to control the people around them telling them what to do. Because people don't like to feel like they're losing their agency because a more experienced player is giving them advice. And realistically, if you're in the middle of a tense situation, if you're in the middle of a fight, and you're not going to have one guy who's also fighting be yelling to 10 people about what they need to do.
Yeah.
So making that clear in advance that speaking requires actions. That if you have a certain number of actions in a round and you want to talk to people, you might not be able to do as much other stuff.
Favorite GM moment?
So my favorite GM moments are any time that the players figure out that the villain might actually be a good guy. It's one of my favorite moments ever because I like to write, my games have a lot of gray morality in them. So the bad guys do bad things, but they often do them for the right reasons. And the good guys seem good, but they also have their own bad things going on. No one in my games is ever like truly good or truly evil. And if they are, they're very rare. So I love when the PCs are in a situation and they say, wow, that guy's might be right. And an example of that is in my game Storm, there was a god called the Raven King. And his duty on the planet was to take magic away from humanity. Mm-hmm. That humanity long ago had gotten magic from the gods, and he had been sent down from the heavens to take it back because we can't be trusted with all this power. And the party was like, oh, screw him. We want magic. Magic's good. Magic makes the world a better place. And they found this powerful, this artifact that would channel their magic and make it more powerful. So they ran into these enemies near a river, and they cast a spell to make the river overflow and destroy their enemies. And then they found out that the spell had overflown the river so much and flooded everything that a village down the river had been destroyed, and people had died, and innocents had been killed because they'd used this magic to destroy their enemies. And in that moment, they thought, maybe we shouldn't have this much power.
Remember that too.
So some of my favorite GM moments are when you've set up something and it pays off, and the PCs are surprised and like really thrown back and happy with this plot point that you've set up over the course of several sessions. So my example is also from Storm. So we had in Idriel, in the country that I built, there was this king, and his whole thing was that he claimed he knew the time of his death. And as a result, he was very cocky. He would go riding into battle knowing he'd be fine because I don't die for a while. And we had this necromancer who had this rod of incredible power. If he pointed it at anything, he could kill whole armies, wipe out units. And the party has met this necromancer, and they come to the king and they say, you got to worry about this guy. Like you can't just go riding off and charge at this guy. He's really dangerous. The king, being cocky, was like, "No, I'm going to charge straight at him." And we knew what was going to happen, and we wanted to show how dangerous this necromancer was. So 3 sessions before the big fight with the big bad guy, we had them meet this guy called the Hand, who was this powerful religious fighter. And he helped them out. He saved them in a couple fights, and for 2 to 3 sessions, he helped them out and showed how strong he was and how cool he was, and the PCs started to really like this guy. They get into the final fight. They're trying to distract the necromancer because they know whoever he focuses on is going to die. And the Hand goes riding up to shoot at the necromancer. The necromancer turns towards him, points his wand, and instantly kills him.
Gone.
Yeah. And the PCs are like, oh my God, this guy was so powerful. This necromancer is ridiculous. There's no way the king's going to be fine. So then the king goes charging up, still just as cocky as ever. The necromancer raises his wand, he points it at the king, and the necromancer's arm blows off. And he just starts screaming in pain. The king rides up to him and finishes him off, and the PCs they were shocked. They did not see it coming, and that was having this payoff of setting up over several sessions all these various NPCs, their interactions with each other and their interactions with the party, and then having them be genuinely surprised.
Quick tip for the audience, GM tip, if you please.
My GM tip is you should be willing to trust people, whether they be your players or your co-GMs or your assistant GMs. You need to trust that people are going to make the right decisions.
So my quick GM tip, this is going to be about combat because that's the thing I feel like I specialize in. And that is you need to be willing to break the rules, to bend the rules in the middle, and be flexible. So I like to come up with combats that are weird and maybe not balanced. Maybe you're fighting something a bit too powerful for the PCs, or they're in a situation that it doesn't look like they can make it out. Be willing to fudge the dice, to, in the middle, change the rules.
Here's a list of tips for today's show for all you listers out there. Tip number 1, split responsibilities. Tip number 2, split the party. Tip number 3, GM collaboration. Tip number 4, learn each other's GM style. And tip number 5, GM mentorship. That's our show for today. Don't forget to ask your GM tip questions in the comments and on Twitter at #AskSatine. Bruce, Keith, thank you so much for coming on. That was awesome. And I feel like I got a good insight on Storm. It's like you play a game for 3 years, you really want to know a little more about it. You can find them on Twitter at Bruce Monach and at Keith Monach. Thanks for watching GM Tips here on Geek and Sundry. As always, I'm Satine Phoenix. You can find me every Sunday with some of my gaming pals on mazercana.com or twitch.tv/mazercana, and dungeon mastering this summer with Rudy on Fury's Reach on twitch.tv/DND. Bruce, Keith, GM us out of here.
Satine, you're riding on your horse, bow at your side, sword mounted on your saddle next to you. You're going through the woods as fast as you can because you haven't heard from your friend. James, he's lost. He's somewhere out here. You were scouting for something dangerous in the woods. You don't know what it is. And then you come up across the woods, open out a little bit, and you hear nothing. The animals are gone. The birds are gone. Below you, there's a short cliff about 10 feet, and you see something terrible. You see your friend covered in blood and something floating above him. It's metal. It moves and it turns. It doesn't have a face. It doesn't have eyes, but it has something, a glow, a red glow. And it starts to scream, but from no mouth. It just floats in the air and comes towards you, this mechanical metal thing. And
What do?
I shoot it with my bow.
Roll. You need a 9 on a d12. That's a miss.
the 6, you miss. You fire your bow. It clinks off its armor, but it doesn't seem to affect it at all. It comes at you. It flies up in the air, and out of nowhere, there's an energy blast, and it's shot out of the sky.
A hand grabs your shoulder.
Oh.
You turn to face it. It's someone wearing what appears to be powered metallic armor. It's glowing. In their hand is a rifle, smoking at the end. You hear in the distance the same screaming, but from at least a dozen more. The person starts to pull you away and says, "Come with me. I can save your tribe, but you have to follow me now."
Yeah.